In this lecture, we turn to realism, another powerhouse intellectual movement, philosophical school that has been enormously influential in the course of education in the modern world. Like idealism, which we looked at in the last lecture, realism is an ancient school of thought. Last time we looked at idealism's metaphysics, epistemology, and so forth. And we looked at two of the representative idealist thinkers, Kant in the modern world. But the first and most influential idealist thinker across history certainly is Plato. He is the first great systematic genius of the idealist tradition. Realism as a school of philosophy is almost as old as idealism as a school of philosophy, and it dates to the generation immediately following idealism. And the first great genius of realism as a school of philosophy is Aristotle. And for many years, Aristotle, when he was younger, was a student of Plato, studied at Plato's academy, and was in many cases, in most respects rather, a devotee of the Platonic or the idealist way of doing philosophy. As he matured and grew older, though, Aristotle diverged significantly from the Platonic way of doing philosophy, and over the course of many decades, Aristotle worked out a systematic school of philosophy that was the opposite, in many key respects, of idealism, or at least in marked tension to idealism as a philosophy. Now, idealism, as we saw, is essentially an otherworldly or a dualistically oriented philosophy. In a nutshell, realism is a much more nature-centered, this-worldly orientation in philosophy. And it's not too much of a stretch to say that the great battle in Western philosophy and Western intellectual life has been the battle between those philosophies that are more idealistically oriented and those philosophies that are more realistically oriented, or to put it in personalized terms, between the Platonists on the one hand and the Aristotelians on the other hand. 19th century thinker Samuel Taylor Coleridge went so far as to say that when everyone is born, or any individual is born, rather, either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. I think that might be a bit of an overstatement. However, there's a great deal of truth to it. There is a third major philosophical position that's been a contender, a much more skeptical and cynical approach to philosophical issues. But nonetheless, it is true to say that the two dominant schools of philosophy over the course of many centuries, and the two dominant schools of philosophy that have had the most influential on the course of education as we practice it in the Western world, have been the Platonic system and the Aristotelian system. The great battle then has been between an idealistic approach to philosophy versus a realistic approach to a philosophy, or to put things in more provocative terms, between schools of thought that are more religion-friendly and those that are more science-friendly. And not, again, to prejudge the issue of the truth or falsity one way or the other, or the issue of whether things necessarily have to be polarized in religion versus science, Platonism versus Aristotelianism, or whether some sort of accommodation or reconciliation position can be staked out in the middle. Nonetheless, there are these polarizing tendencies in the world of philosophical thought. So now what I want to do then is turn to the whiteboard to start to lay out some of the philosophical contrasts between the idealist school of thought and the realist school of thought, to itemize the contrast between their positions in the areas of metaphysics, epistemology, human nature, and ethics.